My name's Ashley Floyd. I grew up as a Georgia native in a town called Winder, Georgia, and then went to college at the University of Georgia nearby in Athens, where I met my wife, who was also a music student. And I did two of my degrees at University of Georgia, so I guess in a lot of ways it makes sense that that's where I ended up settling down. It was in Athens. And currently, I'm just over this past summer taking a position as the band director and music technology teacher at a brand new school in Barrow County of Georgia called the Barrow Arts and Sciences Academy. So music is not only a passion of mine as far as composition, but it is also my day job. As far as my compositional style, I think as with all composers, it's kind of evolved as it's gone along. I think earlier in my career, I was writing the very meticulous, very complicated textures that need a lot of rehearsal to fit together. And although I enjoyed those pieces while I was writing them, I still enjoy go back listening to them. I think these days I have found not only just more success, but also that I'm enjoying the process of writing more by learning to get out of the way and trust the performers and write music that they feel like they can put themselves into, that they're not feeling like they're having to figure out all the time. It allows them to relax and put their own musicianship into a piece. And I've been able to do that, I think, and find still ways that I find are challenging me as a composer in a different way. So rather than trying to put together maybe the most complex textures that I can kind of imagine and notate, like I said, learning to get out of the way and put the performers in situations where their own musicianship is going to be allowed to shine out. This actually was my third time entering the Rapido competition. But let me be clear, it's actually my first time actually completing and sending in a piece. Kind of said to myself, you know what, even if it's not the greatest piece I've ever created, this year I'm going to actually send something in. There's no excuse since I'm kind of on quarantine and around the house anyway. So in some ways this year I found it easier than I have in the past. But I did give myself a little extra hurdle. I really wanted to involve specific performers and not just send in a MIDI rendition of my score. And there's nothing wrong with sending in a MIDI rendition, especially in a timed competition like this. But I knew that with the direction that my style had taken most recently, a MIDI really wouldn't do any service to what the kind of sounds that I was having going on, in my brain. And so actually I only gave myself 7 days to write the piece, because the other 7 days were to send off to performers virtually and have them send me back recordings and then edit those things together. So really, I guess in some ways I made it harder in some ways, but in other ways I think it served me better because it forced me to not overthink things, go with my gut instincts and the things that I knew would sound musical and the things that I wanted to say without overcomplicating. I can't speak for all composers, but I can speak for myself in that having some sort of theme or some sort of direction can help me to narrow ideas. I will speak for all composers, and I guarantee all of us always have ideas running around in our head, and we're always looking for places that we can, or pieces that we can then put those ideas in, or things that might work for a certain situation that wouldn't work for other commissions or that kind of thing. I happen to have some really good friends in the area who including my wife, who plays viola, and another good friend who plays friends who play all the other instruments. And so I was actually able to, like I said, kind of use that instrument base to say, okay, well, I know I've got the musicians available, that the ideas that I want to play with, this would be possible for me to write the piece quickly, get it sent to them, have them record their parts back, and bring that back to me. Simultaneously, the worst and the best part of being a composer is exactly the cliche you were just mentioning of kind of sitting sitting by yourself in a quiet space. In my case, maybe tinkling something on the piano, but really it is kind of a sort of meditative, just sitting there with your thoughts and letting some things play out. I don't have the luxury anymore with having a 2-year-old at home of being able to do that for too long, especially on quarantine. But my wife did know that I was entering this competition, and so we would kind of carve out an hour or two for me to be able to do that kind of time. And then, frankly, the other part that the quarantine allowed for was that when I would take my son on walks, frankly, I'd be working out the piece in my head on those long walks that we would take, once a day and that kind of thing. I knew that my performers would also be in a similar situation. So I knew I wanted to write a piece that I could send to them and that would still work without necessarily everything timing up exactly right. So I knew I wanted a really free-formed piece that had a narrative. In other words, it would still have a climax and have a shape to it that wasn't just allowed to kind of run out at whatever speed, et cetera, but one where it was not necessary for the performers to actually lock in their part, because I knew that my performers wouldn't have a lot of rehearsal time, that they'd have to be able to kind of record on their own and then send to me. I didn't want to ask too much of them because they were just donating their time. So I didn't want to write anything that was going to be so overly challenging that they wouldn't feel like they could really contribute well. And so when I made that decision, that kind of helped to shape the piece as well of how do performers find ways to lock their parts in when a strict metronome or a conductor is not present with them. And so that led me to the idea of, well, we are all kind of controlling our so much about music, including with string players, is about controlling the breathing and phrasing based upon the breath. Why don't I write a piece around that? And of course, the idea of breathing, that seemed to fit with so much about the pandemic that just seemed like a really solid way to go as far as matching the theme, as far as something that would be successful and something that I would find interesting as a composer, the results. What would happen if we created a piece of music that was where all the phrasing was built around breath lengths? Typically when I'm not doing well as a composer, it's because I'm probably trying to put once again, too much of myself, trying to get too overwrought with the ideas and trying to cram too much in. And I just need to learn to step away from that. It's definitely been a good lesson for sometimes your first instincts are often the strongest. You still have to work on them. You still have to refine them. But if you constantly are allowing yourself to take in more influences and that kind of thing, sometimes that can lead to just a confused piece. We're all going through the pandemic together, but not a one of us is having exactly the same experience. So how could I reflect that musically, of having the different musicians seem to be going at their own pace in their own kind of emotional, narrative, simultaneously? How can I make that clear? If I were sitting in the audience listening to my piece, I would hope that the other audience members would be paying attention to each individual musician as kind of an individual, as opposed to a quartet that's actually really working together. I really made an intent to have each musician of the quartet have a different and independent sort of task or musical idea that they're working themselves through at the pace of their own breathing. So all of the phrases themselves, they all begin together, all starting together. And then over the course of their own natural breathing, which of course is unlikely to be the same pace or the same length as the other musician, they get farther and farther kind of torn apart in terms of their pacing. But they're all trying to complete a relatively simple musical task. So you can kind of focus on each one. And then obviously the composite sound just kind of washes over you as a result.